Good morning. My name's Nicola Latimer, and I'm here to tell you about my PhD study, in which I used eye tracking to investigate academic reading on a reading into writing task. My motivations for doing the study really centred around my experience as a language centre manager, which my role was to support learners with their academic skills. The centre was particularly designed to focus on learners with English as a second language. And in that role, I found that graduates often arrived really ill-equipped for academic study, especially their extensive reading skills. Also, that this categorisation of trying to categorise students as either a second language or first language was often irrelevant and unhelpful. In modern Britain today, there are lots of students who have English as a second language because they have another first language at home, but they've had some or a large part of their education in English, and even students who had not had, who'd had the majority of their education in English still struggled, and that certainly wasn't confined to students with English as a second language, especially when it came to reading skills. And what often sent students seeking help was that the first written assignment proved to be a crunch point, that they got to their first assignment and really weren't sure how to tackle it. So if I was going to investigate reading into writing, my first task really was to decide on a model of reading and a model of writing, and I looked at several. But the most in-depth, and I appreciate it's not perhaps a model, but definition of the cognitive processes of reading into writing was Chan's 2013 model, which emerged from her PhD looking at reading into writing. And in that, she divided the process that students go through into a series of cognitive phases, and this had the advantage of linking very nicely to Khalifa and Weir's model of reading, which was particularly useful, I found later on, because it very much focused on the way that reading is used in terms of the reader's goal and readers selecting different types of reading. And Chan's cognitive phases had also looked at the way that reading is deployed, the way that reading is used within the wider context of reading into writing. So that was quite a useful connection between the two models. So my research questions were, what are the characteristics of reading during an academic reading into writing task? What are the similarities and difference between the way first-year undergraduates and third-year undergraduates or postgraduate students tackle an academic reading into writing task? So here I was really looking at trying to understand the differences between less experienced and more experienced academics and the way that they went about the task. And also, what were the similarities and difference between the way high and low scoring participants tackled the task? So for the research design, at the centre of the design there was a task, and this was an academic reading into writing task that had been developed by Krella to be used as a diagnostic test to identify students who would be likely to struggle as they went on with their studies. So there were two sources of information, approximately 600 words across the two sources, about 300 in each. Each had a graphic, and the task, which was designed to be completed in about 60 minutes. I didn't actually set a time limit for the participants, but in fact none of them exceeded the 60 minutes required. And in that 60 minutes they had to identify the problem that was discussed in the 2 articles and its causes. They had to summarise the solutions, and in fact there were 3 solutions. Each text talked about 2 solutions, but in fact one of the solutions mentioned in each text was the same, although it used different wording and vocabulary to describe the solution, but in fact one of the solutions was the same. And then they had to conclude by saying which solution they preferred and justifying that. And they were told to try and write about 250 words, try and confine their answer to about 250 words. I used 2 groups of students, 30 in total, but there were 15 first-year undergraduates and 15 experienced undergraduates, so they were either 3rd years or they were postgrads. So they were a mixture of native and non-native speakers, but all the non-native speakers were judged to be at C1 level, either both rated themselves at their level and in fact had qualifications or time at English-speaking academic institutions, which suggested that they were at that level. And in fact, there was no significant difference between the scores that the 2 groups, that not native and non-native speakers, achieved on the task, which suggests that first and second language didn't have an effect on the task. And I used 3 different methods to investigate their behaviour on the task. One was eye tracking. That was followed by stimulated recall, where they saw their eye traces as they worked. It was speeded up, but we paused it and they were able to, when they felt they were able to tell me, then they could recall what they were thinking and what was behind their reading and writing at that time. And finished with a cognitive process. This is questionnaire, which was based on Chan's cognitive phases in reading into writing. Now, I'll explain a little more about this in a minute, but in fact, the source texts were rated by 3 experts for relevance. They were given 4 categories that they could put each sentence into. That was irrelevant, less relevant, relevant, or highly relevant. And there was a high level of agreement between the experts and the sentences. I think I actually chose to use the average score across the 3 raters. But this meant that every sentence was rated as, they didn't rate any of the sentences as being irrelevant, and they were all rated therefore as less relevant, relevant, or highly relevant. And all of the essays that the students, the participants produced, were double marked by 2 markers using the marking scheme that was designed for the task. This focused on content organisation and language, and there was a high level of agreement between the 2 raters on the overall scores. I think, if memory serves me right, it was about 8. I think the level of agreement. So moving on, this is what the actual setup looked like. So I had quite a large monitor. I had a webcam filming the participant's face. This was just in case there were any problems. If I had a lack of eye tracking data, I needed to be able to replay the webcam, which recorded alongside the on-screen activity, and just check whether it was perhaps because they'd looked away, they'd closed their eyes, they were looking at the keyboard, something like that. So I had to be able to check that a lack of eye tracking data wasn't due to a technical error. I tried to avoid actually sitting directly opposite them. I tried to sit to the side or sort of behind them, and they worked on the task. And the eye tracker was quite a small device that fitted to the bottom of the monitor, and tracked their eye movements while they read and typed their answer. Just to give you a little bit of information generally about eye movements in reading, eye tracking has been used as a tool for a long time, in fact going back over 100 years now, and it's given us a very clear insight, a much clearer insight into the way that reading actually works. And whilst we may think that our eyes glide along the line smoothly, in fact that isn't the case. What we do is we pause and we jump, and these are called, the pauses are called fixations, and the saccades are the jumps between the fixations. So we pause on a word and then we make a jump to another word. In adult reading, those pauses usually last about a quarter of a second, and on average they occur about every 8 characters. The saccades to the next fixation usually are very fast, they only last about 40 milliseconds. And this is what it might look like. So eye tracking data tends to look like that. And as you can see, I've increased the size of these dots that represent it here, because what you can see is that not all movements go forward through the text. About 15% of fixations move back to earlier parts of the text, and these are called regressions. Okay, so when skilled readers read, not every word is fixated. With high frequency or predictable words, they're more likely to be skipped. During saccades, no visual information is registered. The eye is moving too quickly, so we can only take information in when the eye makes this pause, this fixation. And as text difficulty increases, so things like text complexity, sentence length, the frequency of the vocabulary, as those things change and the text becomes more difficult, saccade length reduces and fixation duration increases, as does the rate of regression. Regressions within words, so going back to an earlier part of the word, are likely to represent problems with word recognition or lexical access. So trying to figure out, make a connection in your mind with what the word means. Whilst regressions between words are more likely to represent problems such as syntactic parsing in sentences, so working out the grammar of the sentence. Longer regressions that go across several sentences tend to happen when somebody's reading and then they become confused, or they need to check a fact, when they're integrating information across sentences and they're building a mental model of the text. So regressions of different lengths serve slightly different purposes. And this is what the screen that the participants saw looked like. So at the top here, it didn't have these red boxes. These red boxes are to enable me to identify different parts of the screen for you. So there were instructions at the top that just reminded them that there were 5 pages of text. The first page contained the task, the information about what they had to do, and then the first source of information went from on pages 2 and 3, and the second source went on pages 4 and 5. And as you can see, the text for eye tracking to happen, the text is not so much about the size of the text, but it needs to be well spaced to enable that you can ensure that you know which line of text they're reading. Pages 2 and 4 had a diagram here, and pages 3 and 5 had the text running right across. So that was the source text area, the diagram. In order to move page, and they could move page as often as they liked, whenever they liked, they clicked on these triangles and then the information here changed. And in this area over here, they wrote their own, they typed their answer. Whenever they changed page here, obviously their work remained the same, didn't, this part of the screen didn't change unless they edited their work or added to their work. So the measures that I was going to use for characterising the reading on task. First one was about the distribution of attention between those areas of the screen. So what amount of time did they spend looking at the task instructions? How much time did they spend on the source texts? And how much time did they spend looking at their own written answer? And the next type of analysis so I did was to look at the how attention was distributed across the written source texts according to the relevance of the sentences. And lastly, the different types of reading undertaken. And I'll go on in a moment to explain how I differentiated between different types of reading on the task. So when you're analysing eye tracking data, effectively once the eye tracking is finished, you can download the results into a spreadsheet, which looks a little bit like this. So you can see the participant name, the scene name, so that effectively told me which page they were looking at, a time in milliseconds, a duration of each fixation, so I knew how long each fixation lasted, and then where on the screen, so this X coordinate and Y coordinate tells you where on the screen something's happened. And we've got a broad area of interest here. And this broad area of interest, as I've termed it, this related to number 1 on the previous page. So this enabled me to subdivide the fixations into where on the screen they occurred, whether they occurred on the source text, whether they occurred on the diagrams, whether they occurred on the things like the task instructions, or just in a corner of the screen where there was no text. And then here also the second type of data that I was going to analyse was the according to sentence relevance. So each fixation was coded according to which sentence of the source text it fell on. Now, the third measure, this looking at the types of reading that occurred, going to be done by looking at these X and Y coordinates. So effectively, the direction and distance between fixations can be calculated by comparing each fixation with the previous. So the X value shows you how far left or right a fixation is on the screen. And if we take a fixation and we subtract from the X value for that fixation the X value of the previous fixation, the result tells us if you get a negative value, it indicates a move to the left, and a positive value indicates a move to the right. The size of that value indicates how far left or right, and on average, each character space on the screen equated to about 11 pixels. The Y values, that's this column here, shows you how far up or down the screen the fixation is. And again, if we subtract the Y value of the previous fixation from the current fixation, a negative value indicates that a fixation has moved up the screen from the last fixation, and a positive shows us that they've moved down the screen to a line somewhere below the previous fixation. So again, I knew what, in terms of the size of my text on the screen, what that equated to in terms of pixels, and a Y difference value of about plus or minus 35 indicated that they'd kind of stayed on the same line. Obviously, if it was if you had a difference of more than 70 pixels, that indicated they moved to the line below. 140 pixels meant they'd moved 2 lines below, and so on. So with Khalifa and Weir's definition of reading, they talk about reading in terms of using different types of reading to achieve different goals. So, for example, what we tend to think of reading is a very careful, logical, systematic pursuit through the text, passing along a line, going to the line below, going through that, again going on. So a very progressive pursuit through the text, left to right, dealing with one line at a time. And Khalifa and Weir suggest that that type of reading is when we really need to understand, extract the full meaning from the text. And they say that this is termed as careful local reading when that reading is confined to a single sentence. But once we move on to 2 or more sentences and we're looking to integrate the meaning from 2 or more sentences or from whole paragraphs or text, they term that global reading. So careful global reading is when we carefully go through more than one sentence, several sentences, in order to achieve an understanding, a full understanding of what we're reading. And they talk about expeditious reading, which can include scanning, skimming, searching. Now, what they suggest that expeditious local reading is when we're searching for a word or a piece of information, and they suggest that this search may take place over more than one sentence, but the fact that you're looking for a single piece of information is what makes it local. And they suggest that expeditious global reading skills are when we skim for gist or we search for main or important ideas. Now, I was not able to analyse the eye tracking data in such a way that I could exactly match that. I had no problem using meeting this careful local and careful global. So using the literature about eye tracking, I could set measures which enabled me to say, okay, well, careful reading is going to be a very methodical pursuit through the text. It's not going to be long jumps. They're going to be less than 16 character spaces apart based on the 8 characters on average, between fixations. And they're going to be less than 20% regressions. I allowed a little bit of flexibility there. I think in the literature, on the whole, it suggested 15, but I set my threshold a little higher, and I could check when that type of reading was confined to a single sentence, so that would be careful local, and if that type of reading carried on, continued, extended beyond a single sentence into the next sentence, then that would be global careful reading. However, expeditious reading, I was not able to say whether, because of this search for a single piece of information, but it may extend over more than one sentence, I was not able to categorize the data in that way. That was simply too difficult. I could say whether they were reading, that they were looking at the text, but in an, if you like, a non-methodical, non-sequential pursuit of the text, and it stayed within a single sentence. And I could say whether that type of reading behaviour, pursuit of the text wasn't methodical, they jumped around. I could say whether that extended beyond a single sentence. but I was not able to exactly mirror these. And so for that reason, I termed my other form of reading selective reading rather than expeditious reading, really to try and highlight the fact that it didn't equate exactly to Khalifa and Weir's model of reading. And the way that I was going to analyse my data, I tried using different algorithms, different ways of doing it. And after some experimentation, I adapted a method, a pooled scoring technique used by Campbell and Maglio. And for that, I used an Excel spreadsheet with the data. And then each fixation was scored according to its relationship to the previous fixation in terms of how far it had moved. So fixations that had progressed forward through the text, so where they'd gone along the line, and they'd progressed less than 16 character spaces. And I was able, incidentally, to also include, if you like, from where they'd gone from the end of one line to the beginning of the next line, that was counted as being in the same way. It was called a return sweep. So I was able to identify when they'd gone from the end of one line to the beginning of the next, that was still counted, scored in the same way, that they were progressing forward through the text in a logical way. And that was fixations which had that relationship to their previous fixation was scored as a 1. A short regression where they'd stayed in the same sentence, they'd gone back to either an earlier part of the word or an earlier part of the sentence was scored as a -3. And I had an extra column in Excel which accumulated the scores of each successive fixation. And by doing that, if the accumulated score exceeded 3, a coding of careful reading was applied. So if this pattern of moving progressively, not large, too many jumps, not too large a jump forward, continued, and the regressions were less than 20% of regressions, I was able, that resulted in the score accumulating to such a level that those fixations were applied a careful reading label was applied to that fixation. If the accumulated score was less than 3, a selective was applied. Now, obviously, you can't allow the score to keep accumulating, otherwise at the beginning you'll have, once careful reading is achieved after so many fixations, it will just say that everything's careful reading. But in fact, what I did was, if there was a pause in reading, so if more than half a second elapsed between fixations, if there was a long regression or a long jump forward, so 2 or more lines above or below the last fixation, or if the page was changed, the accumulated score was reset to 0, and this was, I just called this a reset. Now, in addition to coding for the careful or selective reading, whether the reading represented a careful serial pursuit of the text, we also looked at, I also used another formula to consider whether that careful or selective reading was local or global. I did that by looking, each sequence of fixations coded with the same type of reading, so be it careful or selective, was termed an episode of reading. And an additional formula examined the sentence level information from the fixation. So if you remember, we had that column of information where it said, page 1, sentence 1, page 1, sentence 1, page 1, sentence 2, as they went through the text. So that was looked at to see whether each episode looked at within the episode whether those fixations had continued beyond a single sentence. So for each episode, fixations within each episode, fixations that remained within the same sentence as the first fixation of the episode were labelled local. Fixations that moved to a different sentence were labelled as global. And thus all the fixations on the source text were ended up with a label of careful local, careful global, selective local, or selective global. And just before I present you with the results, I'm going to do a quick recap of the methods and the measures, just to help remind you. So I had 3 research questions: the characteristics of reading, which was going to go across all 30 participants. Research question 2, the differences between the way the task was tackled by less experienced and more experienced students, and the group was divided into 2 groups according to their number of years study. And finally, the differences between the way the task was tackled by high and low scoring. And so for that, I took the 5 highest scoring and the 5 lowest scoring participants and looked at their data. And had the eye tracking measures, which I was going to look at the distribution of fixations on the different parts of the task, so the instructions, the source text, their own work, distribution of attention on sentences according to sentence relevance, and then the types of reading by using the algorithm to classify the eye tracking, the reading behaviour, as being careful or selective reading. And I had a stimulated recall and the cognitive processing questionnaire, both of which were used to help. Sorry, that's my dog coughing in the background. Both of those were used to help with the interpretation of the eye tracking data. So the findings for research question 1, characteristics of reading. The distribution across the different parts of the text. Actually, the task instructions didn't receive a lot of attention. Only 6% of the fixations from the readers were actually dedicated to the task instructions. 37% of the fixations were on the written source texts, and 3% were on the diagrams. They spent a lot of time, inevitably, looking at their own work as they typed that, and that emerged. And 7% of the time was just looking elsewhere on the screen, so they might have been looking at the instructions at the top or the buttons to move page. So that was how those figures emerged. And the simulated recall and questionnaire data suggested that participants did adopt strategies to help them decide what to include. And for some participants, they reported that their task representation, their understanding of the task, continued to change and develop as they completed the task. Now, when we look at the attention according to sentence relevance, I had to, because there were not equal numbers of words in each in the groupings, when the sentences were grouped together according to less relevant, relevant, and highly relevant, there were differences in the number of words. And because fixation data tends to be word driven rather than anything else, what I did was I decided to look at the fixations per word of each group to enable me to compare across. So we can see that the less relevant, the words in less relevance, the less relevant sentences per word, they attracted about 27% of the fixations. In the relevant, it was 32, and in the highly relevant, it was 41. So we can see that overall, the participants do increase the amount of attention. They are able to devote more attention to the most high, the more relevant the sentence becomes. But although the statistics suggested that's a moderate correlation between sentence relevance and attention, but also the stimulated recall data suggested that for some students, some sentences were given a lot of attention because they were perhaps more difficult to understand, particularly sentences with more abstract concepts. And students, when they were seen spending a lot of time rereading those sentences, and they reported finding it difficult to understand what the sentence was saying and rereading and focusing on them in order to try and get a fuller understanding. Now, when we go to that third measure, patterns of reading, we can see that overall, I was really surprised by this, that in fact, careful reading accounted for less than 30% overall of the reading that took place, whilst selective reading, so if you like, careful pursuit of the text, where so they might be skimming, they might be searching, they might be scanning to find pieces of information, actually accounted for 70% of the reading that took place on the task. And I was really surprised to find that. I really didn't anticipate that careful reading would be in such a minority. And in fact, most of that careful reading, where they went through the text systematically, took place in just the first 6 minutes of the task. Thereafter, there was very little careful, and certainly very little careful global reading. When I analysed the data again, dividing it into two groups, 15 participants in each group, what we saw there was that whilst the task instructions attracted a similar amount of attention, actually there was a difference between the amount of time that students fixated on their own work, that the more experienced students spent a lot more time looking at their own work. And when we looked at the distribution according to sentence relevance, there was very little difference actually here that we had when I ran Pearson's, that for both groups there was a moderate correlation with not much difference between them. With the patterns of reading, there was more different, and we can see that the undergraduates engaged in more careful reading and less selective, and inevitably for the undergraduate, for the more experienced groups, sorry, the year 3 and the postgraduates, they engaged in less careful reading and inevitably, therefore, more selective reading. However, when I ran statistical analysis, it suggested that the differences were not statistically significant on that. The stimulated recall and the questionnaire data, in terms of distribution on the different parts of the task, the differences that the fixation data suggested was supported with the more experienced students making twice as many comments about high-level revising. Most of the comments from the more experienced group centred around cohesion and coherence of their text. In terms of the patterns of reading, whilst statistically those differences weren't seen as significant, the undergraduates made twice as many references to reading for gist as their less experienced counterparts, and that may help explain that difference in excuse me, a tissue, bless me, in that their increased use of selective reading. So research question 3, the differences between the high and low scoring participants. So just to remind you, that was 5, I took the 5 lowest scorers. And in fact, the 5 lowest scorers were 3 year ones and 2 of the more experienced students, and the highest scorers were 2 of the less experienced students and 3 of the more experienced. So here we can see that when the amount of attention or the number of fixations they devoted to the different parts of the text, different parts of the screen, there was very little difference between those. But where we do see a difference is in the distribution of attention according to sentence relevance. And here we can see that when I ran a Pearson's correlation, that what it showed that there was a moderate correlation for the high scoring students, but actually for the low scoring students there was a very, very low correlation. So they didn't focus as much on the highly relevant sentences in the text as compared to the high scoring. And in terms of their patterns of reading, again, we can see that those differences between careful and selective reading become more pronounced with the low scoring candidates relying more on careful reading and engaging in less selective reading than the high scorers. So in terms of the stimulated data, what really emerged from that was that 3 of the high scoring participants mentioned using task instructions to guide their selection of information, and none of the low scoring participants did this. So effectively, the high scoring participants read the task instruction and really developed from that and immediately a plan. And their reading, they saw their job in reading as to search for information and select information from the text to populate their plan, their writing plan. In contrast, in the questionnaire, low scoring participants felt that they needed to use a lot of information from their memory or their personal experiences, whereas the high scoring students rated that as very unimportant for the assignment. And in terms of editing their work, while both groups saying that they spent the same amount of time looking at their work, what emerged from the stimulated recall and from the questionnaire was that actually the high scorers were more focused on high-level revisions, whereas low scorers' remarks really were focused more on whether they'd correctly paraphrased the information that they'd read. So to summarise the key findings, selective reading skills such as skimming and scanning and search reading accounted for 70% of the reading on the written source text. And careful reading, that's what we typically think of as reading as a very slow, methodical pursuit of the text, accounted for less than 30%. Identifying the most relevant parts of the text is critical to task achievement. And clear task representation and early planning seemed to, for the high scoring participants, influenced their approach to reading and the way that the goals that they set themselves to achieve during reading. So I think if we think about what this what this might indicate in terms of the implications for testing and teaching. Task representation is a difficult process. It's a complicated one that's situated, you know, in the academic genre in which the students are. But students may need practice to develop clear task representation and even an understanding of what task representation is, and help translating those task representations into reading and writing goals, so into a strategy for how they're going to tackle their assignment. Planning academic writing involves setting reading goals. So the most able, the highest scoring participants used a macro plan and slotted information into that plan as they found it in the reading text, whereas low scoring participants tended simply to summarise the source text, using the source text as a guide for their, if you like, to guide their writing and perhaps as a plan for their writing. And really the difference between the two was that what we saw with the more experienced, with the high scoring students was more like knowledge transformation compared to knowledge telling for the lower scoring students. Being able to meet those reading goals really relied on students utilising selective reading skills, which all of the students did engage in selective reading. But I think the more experienced students and the high scoring students did it in a much more targeted and purposeful way. An analogy that occurred to me was effectively going around the supermarket, planning a meal and going to the supermarket. And I think what the stimulated recall data suggested that the highest scoring students generally had a very clear outline of what they wanted to achieve, what their plan, what their finished writing would look like right at the outset. They then went to the task with a very specific goal of finding information that slotted into each part, and they tended to take notes and put notes in the relevant section of their plan as they read. Whereas some other students, although they still achieved a good score, tended to read everything, take that information on board, then go back and look at the task again, and then having made notes while they read, they then had to reorganise that information into a suitable shape, a suitable plan to meet the task. And I think that's just more difficult. It doesn't mean that it can't happen, but I think it's it's more challenging, it takes longer, and it's less likely to result in a really good finished product. So I firmly believe that tasks aimed at selective reading tests, if they were included in academic English tests, I think that would have a positive washback in terms of students' preparedness to engage in academic reading and writing tasks once they arrive at university. Okay, thank you very much. And obviously there were some limitations. The task was very short compared to most assignment tasks, and therefore it might not have elicited the full range of cognitive processes. The reading texts were pre-selected, which doesn't represent the way that it works in the real world. Students often have to go and do a lot of reading in order to find their text, which it may be that actually what we saw was an under-representation of the amount of selective reading that students might need to engage in. Tasks may have not stretched the participants sufficiently, as the scores were quite homogeneous. and the maximum score was 9, and no one scored less than 5. And 19 participants scored at 8 or 9. So there wasn't a really wide range of scores. The limited number of participants obviously means that generalising from the data isn't really possible. But gathering eye tracking data is very time consuming and therefore difficult to do very large numbers of participants. Eye movements can only suggest the cognitive processes. So eye movement patterns can suggest the type of reading that's happening, but we can't be absolutely sure. And of course, on-screen reading may differ from paper-based reading, but I think certainly in light of the recent pandemic, much of the reading that students do is often on-screen rather than in books or on paper. And so I think really on-screen reading perhaps reflects the way that a lot of reading by students is done these days. Okay, thank you very much, and these are my references. Thank you.